Quad Cities Chamber's Business Brief, the World Series of Security Frameworks, featuring Matt Hoeper of Winsor Consulting. My name is Jack Cullen, Marketing and Communications Manager at the Quad Cities Chamber, and this is our very first Business Brief event. Quad Cities Chamber Business Briefs are short, free to attend programs designed to connect organizations with the latest guidance and resources around our uniques at the Chamber, our unique services. Advocacy, financial assistance, business intelligence, and promotions to help your business grow. You can look for business briefs on our website and in our e-news. The content will always be available for you to refer to again after it airs. Now, part 2 of Windsor's business brief on cybersecurity frameworks is scheduled for 10 a.m. next Thursday, November 12th. So if you haven't already signed up for that, you can do so after today's program at quadcitieschamber.com. Let's get started. I would like to introduce Matt Hoeper of Winsor Consulting. Winsor Consulting prides itself on providing first-class IT services and support at an affordable price for small to medium businesses in the Quad Cities, Midwest, and beyond. Matt and his team specialize in compliance and cybersecurity services that can help your organization advance its business goals. Thank you to Winsor Consulting for sponsoring this business brief. Go to windsorconsulting.com for more info on their business. Now, Matt has over 20 years of experience in IT. He holds an undergraduate degree from St. Ambrose University, a master's degree in management information systems from the University of Illinois, and several other certifications. He has worked with Fortune 500 companies and small businesses, including in the fields of engineering, marketing, supply chain, and healthcare. If you have any questions as Matt's presenting, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Matt Hoeper.
Thank you, Jack. It's good to be with you. I love what the Chamber is doing, and it's good to be part of it. Gosh, hearing that over 20 years, it's hard to believe it's been around that. I've been around that long. My gosh. So this webinar is titled The World Series of Security Frameworks. And the reason that I titled it that was a few weeks ago, I was watching my son play basketball. And I had a thought, as they're going back and forth on the court, how difficult would it be to play the game without lines on the court or rules? Or how would we know if somebody was out of bounds? How would we be able to tell who was winning or who won? It would be complete chaos. You have to have those lines on the court. You have to have the rules in the game. It gives us structure. And I think the same is true when it comes to security. You have to have something to measure against. And so we're going to talk a little bit about security frameworks. And we went with World Series because it's autumn. So frameworks, why? So like I said, most importantly, it gives us something to measure against. If you have any sort of compliance regulations that you need to adhere to, it's best to use a framework that helps you understand the risks associated with cybersecurity, the legislation that's coming, whether it be CCPA in California or GDPR in Europe. There's going to be legislation that's coming down, and you want to make sure that your business is adhering to that legislation. Now, frameworks are inclusive. No matter the size of the industry. It doesn't matter if you're a 5-person shop or a 5,000 employee organization. They have a place because it does give you that thing to measure against, and it does employ a continuous learning model. Now, here at Winsor, we use NIST, and most security frameworks categorize these controls in what we call domains. So NIST uses identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. CAS uses something a little different, and I'll get to that in a second. But the controls serve different purposes within a framework. And each framework does things about this, they go about doing things, the same things, but they do it in a little different way. They may categorize things. Now, when I talk about controls, I'll give you an example. So a physical security control might be a fence. So in this particular instance, a fence would be a preventive control. It prevents someone from getting access into your facility. You want to make sure that your organization is secure from a physical standpoint. Door locks would be another example of a physical or of a preventive control. But what about cameras? Now, cameras don't necessarily prevent somebody from getting into your organization. They would be more of a detective control. So they don't prevent you from gaining access, but they would serve a purpose because they would allow you to find out what happened, a detective control. So for the purposes of this webinar, and I'm watching the time here, I need to make sure that I stay on time because I have a tendency to go over. I'm going to talk about the CIS controls. CIS does the same thing as NIST, but it does it in a little bit different way. And I think that CIS is a little easier to understand. It breaks the domains into the basic, the foundational, and the organizational, like you see on the screen here. And you kind of want to start with step one and kind of work your way through. Now, you're likely in your organization working on all of the controls at some level or another. You might be, 70% or 80% of malware defenses, but you might be 20% in vulnerability management, something like that. But generally, as an organization, you're working on all of them. But if you happen to be one of the organizations that's not really doing much of anything, it's really good to start at the very beginning. And notice control 20, penetration tests. So I once had an organization come to me and say, hey, we were breached the previous week and we want to do a pen test. And I look at them and I say, well, I will take your money, but I wouldn't start with a pen test because here's the deal. You had a pen test last week when you were breached and you failed. So we want to make sure that when we do a pen test, we end with a pen test. We don't start with a pen test. Think of your house, for instance. You want to see if a burglar or something can get in. You want to go around and make sure that all the windows are closed and locked, all the doors are locked, your doggy doors, whatever access points you have into the facility before you set someone loose and say, hey, see if you can break in. That's why it's really important to know, don't start with a pen test, end with a pen test. And I'll talk a little bit more about pen tests next week when we do part 2 of this. So start at the very beginning. Step 1, making sure that you have an inventory and control of all of your hardware assets. So when I talk to people about this, I say, in order to secure something, you have to know what it is you need to secure. You have to identify it. So, hardware is a good start. Now I want to take time out for a second. So when it comes to security and the security spend, we always have to balance what we're trying to protect against what we're going to spend. If you have an asset that is worth $5,000, you don't want to spend $10,000 to protect it. That wouldn't make any sense. But when you're looking at computers, there's more than just the hardware aspect of that you're trying to secure. The data on it is very important to you too. My cell phone, for instance, I have a cell phone. It's probably worth $200-300, something like that, from a hardware standpoint. But the pictures and the videos that I have, vacations, kids' first day of school, that is priceless to me. It would be very hard to put a cost on that. But we need to do that as organizations when we're looking to secure something. That's the decision. And that's what makes ransomware so tricky. And I'm sure that you guys have all heard about ransomware in the news. What they're doing is they're taking your data hostage. So it's not just about replacing the hardware, it's about replacing the data and the information that is on that hardware. And that's where we need to make sure that when we're inventorying our hardware, that we're taking into consideration things that you wouldn't necessarily want out there, trade secrets, that kind of stuff, that data. We want to make sure that we're protecting that data. So when it comes to hardware assets, you want to know, what devices do you have? Where are they? And ask yourself, how long before it was stolen would you know? I mean, how long would it take? If a laptop was taken, would you know? And you can do this in something as simple as a spreadsheet. But one thing I always encourage organizations to do is make sure that they know where their hardware is, because we always have to know what we have in order to protect it. So control 2 is inventory and control of software assets. So we've gotten to the point where we know where our hardware is. Now we're going to talk about software. One of the best ways that bad actors, hackers, gain access to your organization's network is by looking for vulnerable versions of software that would be able to give them the ability to remotely exploit that vulnerability. So it's important as an organization that you know what software you have. Could there be any unauthorized software on your network? How would you tell? Would you notice any unauthorized software or malware? Because those compromised machines are launching points to the rest of your network. If you have a poorly controlled machine, it is entirely possible that it's running malicious software. And that's why it's important to have an inventory of your software and then continually audit that list of running software against that inventory. If a machine is running software that it shouldn't be, you would then know. So hardware, software. Third one, continuous vulnerability management. I put a note on this slide. There's going to be a few of these controls that, and they're all important. I want to state that on the onset. They're all very important, but some of them are just a little more important that you should be maybe paying just a little bit more attention to than some of the other ones. And I see this one as one of them. So I think we all understand this one. Software and firmware vulnerabilities, they just need to be patched. But sometimes updates or machines and firmware machines, they may slip through the cracks or they may be overlooked. And that's why you need to regularly scan for vulnerabilities. Nessus is a good one. Rapid7 is another good one. If a machine on your network isn't being patched, wouldn't you want to know? So ask yourself, do you regularly scan for vulnerabilities? Do you do anything with the vulnerability reports? You may scan your network for vulnerabilities, but then that thing just ends up in a drawer somewhere and you're not doing anything with it. So make sure that you're doing something with it. Always figure out how you're handling patch management. And I would do it on a regular basis. And this, like I noted before, this is something that you should be challenging your managed services provider or your IT department on. Ask those questions. How are we doing for vulnerability management? The next one, controlled use of administrator privileges. And I see this a lot. Everybody has admin privileges to their local machine. And to me, that's kind of a no-no. We don't want users to have any greater access to stuff than what they need to do their jobs. It's a least privilege type thing. So always make sure that you don't give your users admin privileges to their machine, allowing them to install software or make critical systems changes. Because if that user is compromised, guess what? The bad guy has whatever access level or privilege level that user has. And you're making it easier for the attackers. So ask yourself, do users have admin privileges to the machine? If they do, maybe not do that. Do you log the creation of administrator accounts? So if you have a situation where you have 5 domain administrators, would you know if a 6th one was created? And you always want to limit the number of administrators. And then make sure that you separate accounts. Now, it's very easy. I was an IT manager for 10 years. It's easier for me to always do things in my domain administrator account, because then I don't have to switch to another user. But that's something that you don't want to do. You don't want to do everything as a domain admin, because again, if your credentials are compromised, the bad actor, that bad guy, that hacker has whatever access level you have. So do domain administrator activities with your domain admin account, but then use a regular account for things like checking email or surfing the web or something like that. So domain admins are especially susceptible to this. So always make sure that you're separating out accounts. Control 5, secure configurations for hardware and software. Out of the box, a lot of software and hardware configurations are really set up in a way to help with the user experience. They're not necessarily looking for security. So we want to make sure that we secure them, change the default settings to make them something more secure, open ports, default usernames or default accounts and passwords. All servers should be built to the same standard. We call that hardening. And all workstations should be built to a standard. If you have a lot of machines with different security settings, that makes it a lot more difficult to keep up with the security, because as you've probably heard, complexity is the enemy of security. So make sure that when you roll out mobile devices and laptops and workstations and servers at your organization, that you have them set to a security standard and you have configurations set up in place. And this is another thing that you should be challenging your managed services provider or IT department on. And this is where COVID has been very difficult, because a lot of people are working from home. And if they're working on their home computer and they have access to the network, you as an organization don't necessarily have access to control the configurations on those users' machines. So that adds another layer of complexity and another potential inroad into your network by a bad actor. So,
Hey, Matt, sorry to interrupt, but we have a question from an attendee.
Sure.
So the question is, what type of questions should they ask their IT provider when it comes to their own firm's security?
Well, I would ask about the continual vulnerability management. How are you handling patching? So managed services providers really are doing three main things. They're doing backups, which we'll get to. They're doing monitoring of your network, and they're doing patching. We want to make sure that we're testing and looking over shoulders to make sure that that stuff is actually being done, because all it takes is one machine to be overlooked. So vulnerability management would be a question that I would ask. How do you handle that? What are you doing? Are you running scans on the network to kind of double check yourself and make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do? When it comes to secure configurations for hardware and software, what hardening standard do you have for my workstations? What steps do you take to make sure that my workstations are actually secure and not just taking something out of the box, plugging it in and going? Those are the questions that I would ask. And there'll be a few more as we go along here too. Does that answer?
Great, thanks, Matt.
You're welcome. And we're blowing through these in a half hour. And I think what we'll do is we may have a series where we actually do a deeper dive into each one of these controls. I think that'd be something that would be good to do. So control 6, maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. So like I said before, I was a security manager or a IT manager for 10 years. And truthfully, I normally only looked at logs when there was a problem. But we should be looking at logs regularly. If a log file was to tell you that a username and password has been tried like 100 times in a minute, that should be a red flag. No user could try their credentials in 100 times in a minute. I would want to know that. If a user account has been elevated to domain level, administrator level access, I would want to know that. So flag on that. Make sure that you're collecting the logs, make sure you're managing the logs, make sure that you are analyzing the events. And the best way to do that is to aggregate the logs. I would put all the logs in the central repository. It's easier to manage, so I'm not logging into a whole bunch of devices. So have all of your servers, firewalls, all that stuff in centrally located to make sure that it's just a lot easier to go to one place to manage things than it is to go to multiple places. Now, when it comes to logs, a lot of people are keeping logs, but they keep them for the purposes of maybe some regulatory requirement or something like that. But the bad actors are counting on the fact that you're not regularly looking at the logs. So don't just wait for something bad to happen, your network to go down or something, before you check the logs. You should be looking at them regularly. And again, this is something I would challenge your managed services provider. What are you doing from a log management standpoint? Are you regularly reviewing stuff and staying on top of things? Because we want to make sure that we're staying proactive. Oh, doing great on time. Control 7, email and web browser protections. Always use the latest version of your browser. When it asks to update, update it. And now you knew you couldn't get through an IT presentation without some acronyms. I'm going to throw 3 of them out. SPF records. So SPF records, and you should be implementing this, they're part of your DNS records. And what they do is they list all of the host names and IP addresses that are permitted to send email on behalf of your domain. It's a check to prevent spoofing. And spoofing is somebody pretending to be somebody they're not. So you kind of want to make sure that you're looking at a list and checking on that list. So that's SPF, so sender policy framework is the acronym on that. Implement DMARC. So DMARC, domain-based message authentication or reporting conformance, something like that. What it is a control that sets rules in place of what happens when a message was to fail on an authentication test. So maybe you have a situation where the recipient server can't verify that the message's sender is who they say they are. So implement DMARC. And then DKIM is another one you should be implementing too. And these are not difficult to set up at all. DKIM is domain keys identified mail. And it's put in place to make sure that email messages are not altered in transit between the sender and the recipient servers. So it's just a check and balance to verify who the sender is. Are they who they claim to be? And so SPF, DMARC, and DKIM. Now you can be a hit at your next Trivial Pursuit night if that question is ever asked. Malware defenses. I think a lot of organizations rely too much on antivirus alone. And it's very important to know that there is a difference between regular AV, regular antivirus, and endpoint protection. So I'll explain it here. Antivirus is by and large signature based. So you take the human body, for instance. If we get a virus like chickenpox, you only get the virus once, right? So your body can see the signature of that virus and say, oh, I know what that is, and protect against it. The same is true when it comes to computers. Your antivirus is checking a signature against a list of known viruses, and it protects you against that. The thing is that the bad guys are getting a lot more sophisticated, and we need something, an endpoint detection and response, that is more behavior-based. What is the particular malware doing? Is it trying to execute code to the internet, or is it trying to get a hold of my storage area network? Something like that. I want to know the behavior, because if I know the behavior, then I can control the installation of a particular malware, and I would be able to minimize the spread. So endpoint detection and response, what it typically does is it sees that behavior taking place and then it isolates that machine so it stops the spread of whatever is going on, like ransomware, to the rest of your network. And it's very important. So I would say, don't rely on antivirus alone. And WebRoot was one of them, that if you're just running basic WebRoot, that's probably not going to protect you as much as it needs, as much as you need. So whatever you're using, and again, challenge your MSP or IT department on, make sure that you're using some sort of endpoint detection and response that's looking for behaviors, not just signatures. Control 9, so limit and control network ports, protocols, services. Make sure that only network ports, protocols, and services that are listening on a system they only have validated business needs, is what I would say. So if you have a switch that is open and accessible, lock down the ports so that nobody can just plug in with a network cable, be assigned an IP address, and then have access to your network. Any unused ports should be locked down. And that's an easy thing to do if you have a managed switch. You just go in there and shut those down. So I would also take it one step further, and I would run port scans on a regular basis to see if there's anything nefarious on your network. Again, it doesn't take that much time to do, but just run a scan and see if there's anything running that shouldn't be. And our 10th control for today. Oh, I'm doing great on time. This is great. Data recovery capabilities. So backups are critical to your organization. How many times have you seen or heard of an organization that maybe had a fire or a tornado came through and it just destroyed everything and they didn't back up? So make sure that you're doing regular backups. Make sure you have an offsite copy of a backup. And there's two things that I want to cover in this. RPO, which is recovery point objective, and RTO, recovery time objective. What that means is recovery point. Ask yourself as an organization, meet as leadership and an executive team or something, and say, okay, how much data could I lose and still be okay? Could I lose a day's worth of data? Could I lose a week's worth of data? At what point would I be like, oh gosh, I can't recover? So figure out how much data you can lose. We'll call it a day. So do nightly backups and then have something pushed off site so that if something does happen, you only lose a day's worth of data. The second thing is recovery time objectives. So how much time would it take, or how much time could I afford to be down before things are back up? 4 hours, 8 hours, a week, 2 weeks, a month? And then make sure that your backup strategy is in alignment with those two things: your recovery point objective, how much data could I lose, and recovery time objective, how long would it take me to get back up? And then make your backup strategy align with that. But those are determinations that you make as a business, and there's no one size fits all. Just know that the smaller the window, the more expensive it's probably going to be, because you're going to need to, I mean, if your backup or your recovery time objective was, 4 hours, then you need to be backing up 4 hours. And make sure that you're encrypting your backups just in case, and store those keys off-site. I've seen organizations store encryption keys in Active Directory. They get ransomware, and even though they've done a great job of air gapping their backups, making sure they're 100 miles away, encrypted and all that stuff, they're now bricks because they don't have their encryption keys. They were stored in Active Directory. So get a USB drive or something, store those keys on that, and then put it in a safe deposit box somewhere. So security assessments. I wanted to touch on this because we want to make sure that we are in alignment with these controls in these security frameworks. So I would recommend doing a security assessment if you want to do it yourself through a checklist. If you want to hire somebody, sometimes it's always nice to get another set of eyes on things, but do an assessment to figure out where you're at. So when I meet with a client and they say, hey, we want to be more secure, what would you recommend? I can't make any recommendations until I know what their environment looks like. So any recommendation that I would make, I won't know. It's like taking your car to the mechanic. You have to assess what is going on with the car before you fix it. You don't want to just change your brakes if your brakes don't need to be changed, or change your oil if it doesn't need to be changed. So I would always recommend that we do security assessments regularly. So next week, we are going to go through controls 11 through 20 of CIS. So stay tuned. We got a cliffhanger there. Any questions?
If there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box.
And reach out to me if you have any questions. I always have a daily quirky post. It's been a rough year for everybody. We could use a laugh. So, follow me on LinkedIn, connect. I'd love to meet with you. If you want a copy of today's slides, email info@windsorgroup.com. I'd be happy to send you a copy of these slides.
That's great. Well, if there aren't any questions, I want to thank you, Matt. Awesome job. And yes, please take his advice. Connect with him on LinkedIn, because his daily posts, thoughts, musings, anecdotes that he shares are just awesome. And there's always a tie back to security. So they're informative as well. We want to thank Winsor Consulting again for sponsoring today's business brief. As a reminder, recording of this program will be posted on our website later today. And we'll try to get those slides up there as well. And please join us for part 2 of Matt's presentation next Thursday, November 12th, same time. And sign up at quadcitieschamber.com. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.